Okay, this is Psalm 25, verse 6. Remember, O Lord, your tender mercies and your loving kindness, for they are from of old. Do not remember the sins of my youth, nor my transgressions. According to your mercy, remember me for your goodness' sake, O Lord. Good and upright is the Lord. Therefore he teaches sinners in the way. The humble he guides in justice, and the humble he teaches his way. All the paths of the Lord are mercy and truth, to such as good, to such as keep his covenant and his testimonies. For your name's sake, O Lord, pardon my iniquity, for it is great. Well, Father, we do come to you and we acknowledge that we are sinners and we're in need of your work in our souls and spirits. And we thank you that you choose and are willing to do that. And we invite you to do that now by the power of your Spirit and through your word. And it's in Jesus' mighty name we pray. Amen. Okay, so last time we finished up chapter 41. And if you remember, you know, we're really dealing with Joseph at this particular point in time, at least within the Genesis story. And Joseph was pulled out of jail to interpret the dreams of Pharaoh. But before that, remember, Joseph really had no reason to believe he was ever going to get out of jail. Okay, he kept believing in God, and he had those dreams from when he was a young man, a teenager. But really, there was no real reason to believe that this was going to happen until Pharaoh has these two troubling dreams, and all the Egyptian, wise men and magicians and the interpreters, they can't figure it out. So they call Joseph, and he interprets them, but he says, well, it's really not me, it's God. And he told Pharaoh that, look, there's going to be 7 years of extreme abundance, followed by 7 years of famine. And the famine would be so severe that it would essentially overwhelm and eliminate any remembrance or any prosperity left over from the 7 years of abundance. And then if you remember, Pharaoh then realized that Joseph was uniquely qualified by God to see and understand these things that the men in Egypt just didn't. And Joseph had given him a plan along with the interpretation. Here's what to do to keep this from getting really bad. Store up everything for 7 years. Take an extra 20%, and then have it for when the famine comes around. And so Pharaoh made Joseph, and we found the Egyptian word for it. It was vizier, the grand steward over all the house of Egypt. And it's interesting if you think about it, because when Joseph first gets to Egypt, what is he? What role does he have once Potiphar buys him?
He's a slave.
But what's his role? What's his assignment in the house?
Part of the household.
Yeah.
But what was he in charge of?
Well, he runs
The whole household. He was the steward. There were many other slaves, but he was the steward over the whole household. So he starts as the steward of Potiphar's home. Now he's the steward of all Egypt. Okay? Everything in Egypt.
Promotion.
What's that?
That's a big promotion.
Yeah, he just has to go through a few years of jail first. And so now all activities of state are under his control, and he's in second in command to Pharaoh. Now this is essentially, when you think about it, this is essentially the fourth time Joseph has had this role. And I think this is kind of interesting to see, because it shows a progression, like you said, in the, if you will, the promotions. Okay, when Joseph was at home with Jacob and his brothers, who was the one who had the coat and was overseeing the brothers, even though he was the youngest?
Joseph.
Joseph. And then he goes down to Egypt as a slave, and he gets himself to a position, and God does, where he's the steward over Potiphar. And then he goes into the jailer, and how was the jailer treating Joseph in jail?
He was the person in charge.
Yeah, he was in charge of everything. And so Joseph literally keeps going to those kinds of positions, and we see that God is growing Joseph in many ways, teaching him to to trust in God, to have confidence in God, regardless the amount of time that it takes, regardless of the situation that he's in. And he keeps also honing his skills for administration and oversight and stuff like that. And, as we said last time, while in Egypt and to the Egyptian, leadership, Joseph probably seems to be an overnight success. What we see is that God has been growing him and preparing him for 13 years. Okay, and it's interesting to see that because God does the same thing in our lives. He's preparing us and training us now for whatever else it is to come. Okay, and I don't know what it is in your life. I'm not even sure I know what it is in my life. Of course, we'll have a better idea when we get there. But the point is that God is working in you whether you know it or not. Okay. Now in Joseph's case, it's interesting because these 13 years of training are, we would say probably just getting ready now to start showing their advantage. He's getting ready to start utilizing, all of this stuff. But in the same token, what that really means is the biggest challenges that he's got are just about to start. That this is what God has been preparing him for. And all that we've been reading so far is just to get him to this place. It's really kind of, the preparation in the background. Really, the real story starts now. So just with that little bitty reminder, okay? Now, if you remember, in the last verse of chapter 41, what we read was, "And the people of all the earth came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph, because the famine was severe in all the earth." So Joseph had essentially taxed everybody 20%. They had a much larger yields than anticipated, than normal. The abundance was everywhere. So the crops were very, very prosperous. He took 20%, which is actually quite a bit more than their normal 20% because the crops were in such abundance. And he's been saving it all up. And now, just as the dream said, okay, the people from that entire part of the world are coming down to Egypt to buy grain because they just don't have it. And what they're doing is they're literally buying it from Joseph because of the famine. Okay. All right. Well, why don't we start in chapter 42? Maya, would you read verses 1 through 6, please?
Sure. When Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you just keep looking at each other?" He continued, "I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us, that we may live and not die." Then 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt, but Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with the others, because he was afraid that harm might come to him. So Israel's sons were among those who went to buy grain, for the famine was in the land of Canaan also.
Okay.
Now, Jeff, you want me to read number 6 or no?
Sure.
Now Joseph was the governor of the land, one who sold the grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground.
Thank you. And we have 7 through 13.
Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he acted as a stranger to them and spoke roughly to them. Then he said to them, "Where do you come from?" And they said, "From the land of Canaan, to buy food." So Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. Then Joseph remembered the dreams which he had dreamed about them, and said to them, "You are spies. You have come to see the nakedness of the land." And they said to him, No, my lord, but your servants have come to buy food. We are all one man's sons. We are honest men. Your servants are not spies. Can we go ahead?
Yeah, keep going.
But he said to them, No, but you have come to see the nakedness of the land. And they said, Your servants are 12 brothers, the sons of one man in the land of Canaan. And in fact, the youngest is with our father today, and one is no more.
Okay, that's good. Okay. So in verse 1, notice, we're kind of switching back and forth here. So the focus of the story temporarily focuses back or switches back to Canaan and on to Jacob. And notice that Jacob hears that there's grain in Egypt, which clearly indicates that indeed this famine is pretty widespread. And apparently there are only a few provisions left in the land of Canaan, that they're in a pretty bad place. Okay. And in fact, in verse 2, he says, Behold, I've heard there's grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us from that place so that we may live and not die. So Jacob himself is telling us that this is severe enough a famine that he's got concerns about the longevity of the family if they don't go get some food. Now it's interesting, and we won't go into this too deeply, but you do see part of what's going on here. God has led them into this promised land. He's told them it's a promised land. And remember how he led Jacob back from being in the Northland, from being up with Laban. He brought him back to this promised land, and now there's this famine. And so God is using these natural events, he's actually creating them to get people to do what he wants them to do. He's not making Jacob essentially make this decision for him, but Jacob is just naturally, because of the famine, choosing to send the boys down. Now, notice he says in verse 1, hey, why are you staring at one another? I think it is kind of interesting just to see the interaction between Jacob and the sons. I mean, the sons, if Joseph is over 30 and the famine has started, so he goes into service for Pharaoh when he's 30, Joseph does. And if there's 7 years of plenty, Joseph is now approaching 40. So his brothers are, somewhere between a few years to like up to 13 years older than he is. So they're approaching, 50, maybe mid 50, something like that. And Jacob's answer to him is, hey, what are you staring at each other for? Like, we're hungry. Go. There's grain in Egypt. What are you doing here, right? It is also interesting to remember and perhaps think that Jacob may also be aware of the story of his grandfather Abraham. And you remember that in Abraham's day, shortly after he gets to the promised land, there's another famine. And yet, instead of staying in the promised land where God had promised to take care of him, okay, Abraham did what?
Went to Egypt.
He went to Egypt. And what happened when they were down in Egypt?
It was about his wife, he said she wasn't his wife.
Yeah, nothing good. Specifically in Genesis 12:1, we read, now there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe. And as we said, nothing really good happens. And maybe maybe Jacob remembers that story of his grandfather, and that's partly why he's sending the sons instead of going himself. Okay, but that's a conversation for later. Verse 3, then the 10 brothers of Joseph went down to buy grain in Egypt. Okay, so they go. Now this is probably it's probably less than a 2-week trip. Okay, but they travel down there. And it says in verse 4, but Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin with his brothers, for he said, I am afraid that harm may befall him. Now, Joseph's been gone. He was 17 at the time. He's been gone 13 years plus the 7. So he's been gone in Egypt for 20 years, which means Benjamin's got to at least be in his 20s. We don't know exactly how old Benjamin is. Okay, but he's at least in his 20s. He's a man. Okay, he's not a baby. But look at what Jacob is saying about him. And joke, he doesn't want to send Benjamin with the brothers, for I'm afraid that harm may befall him. What is Jacob actually saying?
Well, he's worried because his other favorite son never came back.
Okay.
Do you think he treated Benjamin special too? Like, do his brothers hate him too?
Well, we're going to find out about the brothers and the hatred of them. Special in some ways, at least, but there's no indication that there's coats involved and things like that. And probably Jacob, I'm guessing, Jacob has learned a little bit of a lesson not to elevate Benjamin as high above the other brothers as he did Joseph. But that's a guess. Okay.
Well, maybe Jacob has an inkling that, I don't know, because, he doesn't send Benjamin. Do you think in the back of his mind he wonders if the brothers did something?
Well, we'll talk about that in a few minutes, okay, or maybe next time. I don't remember how far. I don't know how far we'll get today, but that's a really interesting question. But what did he tell the sons to do? The other 10?
Go get grain.
Go get grain. But don't take Benjamin because it could be dangerous.
Oh, so he doesn't give a shit about the others?
That's what it sounds like to me. That's exactly what it sounds like to me. It's okay if I lose you, but I'm not sending Benjamin. Okay? It's got to be hard to hear something like this. He tells his 10 sons to go. It's going to be an arduous trip, okay, even though it's not all that far. It's going to be arduous. But Benji, like I said, this is why I said he's got to be at least in his 20s, okay, probably mid-20s, okay? Maybe even older if Joseph is really, like 37. Maybe Benjamin's 30 or 32. I don't know. But don't take Benjamin because it might not be safe. He's literally telling the older 10 brothers, you're expendable. You're not important to me. But he is, Maya, to your point, saying, but Benji is special because you can't take him. Verse 5. Oh, by the way, notice that he's referred to as Jacob here. Remember earlier on when a few chapters ago when God renamed him Israel?
Israel.
Yeah. And so just sometimes it's interesting to notice that. Okay. So now it says the sons of Israel came to buy, So the sons of Israel come to buy grain among those who were coming, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. So there's a bunch of people coming from Canaan down, is what it sounds like. And like I say, here Jacob is referred to as Israel. Well, I think, I don't know, the Bible doesn't fully tell us. It lets you think about it, okay? But we're going to see, of course, that God's plan ultimately is, at least for the while, for the family to go down to Egypt and to have food in Israel and to be, for them and to be reunited and to be sustained and everything else. So I don't know for sure, but it would seem that in going down to get grain and come back, at least right now, this is enough in accordance with God's plan that the Bible refers to him as Israel. So, I think you could argue that Jacob sending the sons is consistent with God, with what God would have him do. Now, so they go down to Canaan to buy the food, and this is going to be one of those places, in the Bible where we get to see essentially a tad of God's sense of humor and a little bit of justice. The brothers are no different. They're, all the people around here are hungry. They need food. The whole world is coming down there. And so they're just amongst everybody who's there. And they're going down to Joseph to get the food because of the position God has put him into. In verse 6, now Joseph was the ruler over the land, and he was the one who sold to all the people of the land. So I don't know exactly what that means, but what it sounds like is everybody who came down there, you had to do a deal with Joseph. I don't know how much bargaining or negotiation or justification was involved. Maybe Joseph's doling it out little by little, but Joseph is involved. It's not a bunch of flunkies and only them. Joseph is involved in it. Okay, he's administering this whole thing, and so we read in the second part of 6. So Joseph's brothers came in and bowed down to him with their faces to the ground, which is to be expected. I mean, what else would they do? They're starving. They need his permission to get food to survive. He's second in command to Pharaoh. Egypt's the most powerful country around. Of course they're going to bow down. But what's the interesting part of them bowing down?
It was his dream. He dreamt it years before.
He dreamt it years before. And so here they are, not just bowing down for him, but think about it. They're coming, their entire lives right now are dependent on Joseph, right? All he's got to do is say, nothing for these guys. Give them enough just to get them back to Canaan, get them out of our land, send them and let's let it go. Now the word here for ruler, my translation says Joseph was the ruler. The word in the Hebrew is ruler or governor. Literally, a little bit more literally, it means master or the one who has dominion. Okay? And it includes this concept of mighty, as in mighty and powerful. Okay? So there is no doubt here, Joseph is completely in charge. Pharaoh has just given him this responsibility. He's in charge. He can do whatever he wants. And I think that that's important to think about as we read about this exchange. Nobody is going to question Joseph. He can give him a bunch of food. He can give him no food. He can do whatever he wants. Nobody is going to question what he says. In part because he predicted this famine was coming, and he's put them into a position where they can potentially survive this. Okay? Now, as you remembered back in chapter 37, verses 7 and 8, is where Joseph has this dream, and we read there, behold, as he tells them the dream, behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to mine. His brother said to him, Are you indeed to reign over us? Or are you indeed to rule over us? So they hated him even the more for the dreams, for his words. And it makes you wonder what Joseph is thinking right now. Okay? And we'll get back to that in a second. So verse 7, when Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he disguised himself. Now remember, when he was brought out of jail, they did what with him?
Cleaned him up.
They cleaned him up. They shaved him because that was the Egyptian way. Okay, the Canaanites and the people up there, they had beards. The Hebrews all had beards. Okay, later they're going to be told don't cut your beards. Through Moses. So they've got beards. And of course, the Egyptians are walking, and cleaned up, and they dress a different way. They've got a different culture. And remember, Pharaoh had given him, the necklace and the rings and all the trappings and fine linen and everything else. And so he's got to be pretty rich. So they don't recognize him in part because it's been 20 years, and in part because he looks like an Egyptian. I mean, he's been there ruling for 7+ years, so he's gotten pretty good at it. He's been accepted by the people, and I'm sure he's looking fully Egyptian. And so there's no way that they would recognize him. And notice that it says he spoke to them harshly or roughly. Now that's indeed what that word means, okay? However, there are people who believe, and you'll see this in a little bit, that it may not just mean like what he said to them was harsh and abrupt and challenging, although it is going to be these things. But it also means, or could mean, that he spoke to them in Egyptian. Okay? And they don't know Egyptian, and you're going to find out that there's a translator there. Okay? But you're also going to find out Joseph remembers Hebrew. Okay? So he spoke harshly to them, and he said to them, "Where have you come from?" And they said, "From the land of Canaan to buy food." Okay? But Joseph recognized his brothers, although they did not recognize him. Now that's a huge advantage when you think about it. He knows who they are, but they don't have any idea who he is. Okay. In verse 9, Joseph remembered the dreams which he had about them and said to them, "You are spies. You come to look at the undefended portions of the land." Now the word for spy means someone to be an explorer or tale bearer, in other words, a snitch, okay, a slanderer or a backbiter. What he's really saying is, you've come down here to wander around, explore, and then bring back word of this to other people. Okay. Now, why would Joseph say this?
Is he trying to set them up?
Is he trying to do what?
Set them up.
Okay.
To look like they shouldn't get any food.
Or
to make them nervous, thinking they're not going to get food.
Yeah. Were you going to say something, Ray?
No, just he's trying to figure out what their character is. Have they changed at all? Have they, so he's setting up to, so he can question them further, and he probably already has a plan to how he's going to deal with them, and he probably wants to find out about Benjamin and all of that.
He's going to put them through a series of tests and trials, and we're going to see this as we go. He's going to test to see what their conscience is like, their character, and he's going to also eventually test and find out what their commitment is like to Benjamin. To your earlier point, Maya, do they hate and are they jealous of Benjamin just like they were of him? Because he knows his father, and he knows that if he's not there, it is most likely that he's taking special care of Benjamin because they have the same mother. Their mothers were both Rachel. Okay, and so he's going to put them through a bunch of tests, and remember, as I said, being second in command and being the one who's in charge of the food supply right now during a huge famine, there isn't anybody who's going to mess around with Joseph. So he can accuse him of anything he wants, and who's going to argue with him, right? And so he calls them spies just to start to see what they're going to do. Now it's interesting that the brothers don't recognize Joseph, so they don't know how to respond to him. The only way they can treat him is it's like as if you were in front of Pharaoh. Okay. Well, we read in Zechariah, one of the prophets near the end of the Old Testament, in chapter 13, verses 5 and 6. Zechariah is prophesying about a time when the Messiah will come. And in verses 5 through 6 we read, "But he will say, I am no prophet, I am a worker of the soil, for man sold me in my youth. And if one asks him, What are these wounds on your back? He will say, the wounds I received in the house of my friends. See, Zechariah was prophesying that the Messiah would come and the Jewish people wouldn't recognize him. And when he comes back the second time, the wounds will be what will help them recognize, holy smokes, this really is the Messiah. They'll have already figured it out from the witnessing and everything else and the prophesying that's going on during the tribulation period. But those wounds will be significant, and that's when they'll recognize for certain that as a people, they did not recognize their Messiah the first time. And so here's Joseph in charge of their livelihood, in the sense of, if he doesn't give them food, they're going to die. He's providing them with bread. Okay, it's just another one of those similarities between Joseph and Jesus' life. Now, Joseph, if you think about it, taking it from his point of view, like I said, he can say anything he wants. Nobody's going to object. The brothers don't know what to, they got to treat him like he's the head of Egypt, because he essentially is. Okay? And at the same time, Joseph has been in this role now for 7 years. He understands how much authority he has, and he knows just how far he can push it. Now, I want you to think about this for a second. If you were in Joseph's spot, what would you do? And I think as we read through this, what we see is Joseph is going to display incredible control and forbearance, considering the fact that he has unquestioned authority over the entire land. Okay? All right. So it says, Joseph remembered the dreams which he had had about them, and he said to them, you are spies. Now, why is it important that we read here that Joseph remembers the dreams?
Well, he's recognizing what God told him this was going to happen.
See, the brothers don't know who he is, right? They don't recognize him. So there's no way they would be triggered to think about that event all those 20 years ago. Joseph, on the other hand, remembers that dream, and because he interpreted the cupbearer and the baker's dreams correctly, because he interpreted Pharaoh's dreams correctly, and because he had that dream right this instant, he knows what? That dream has been fulfilled. It was from God, and it was true prophecy. So if Joseph had any doubt at all about the brothers coming down, and I'm guessing he realized that this was going to happen. Again, just a guess. You go to Pharaoh and you say, look, there's going to be this huge famine, blah, 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 blah. Pharaoh puts you in charge of everything. You're going to dole out the food. He probably has known or suspected that the brothers sooner or later are coming down. Okay, but now, not only do we see the prophecy is fulfilled, it was indeed a dream from God, but Joseph knows it now too. And I think that's going to give Joseph a little bit of confidence in terms of what he thinks he can do and what he thinks he should do. And remember, this is why I keep saying Joseph, God has been preparing Joseph. He's not just preparing him to deal with the famine. He's preparing him for when his brothers return. Now, Joseph is going to specifically start to arrange things. And we're going to see that he's going to be able to find out about his father, how Jacob's doing. He's going to find out about his brother, how Benjamin is doing, whether they're all still alive. He's going to find out whether the brothers are remorseful, okay? And he's going to put them through a series of tests, like I said, to reveal their conscience. Do they feel bad about what they did? Their character, okay? And even do they have any compassion? And all of this stuff is going to unfold. But Joseph is going to be very shrewd here. He is not going to reveal himself until he knows the brothers for sure. and he knows what they feel, where they are, and the answers to those questions. And that should lead us to ask another question, okay? Why? Why doesn't Joseph just right now say, hey, you dirtbags, I'm your brother Joseph. How hungry are you? What you,
He's a good person.
okay, but why else?
Because I mean, because he trusts in God and he has.
Absolutely. They're absolutely okay. So he's a good person because God has been preparing him for this reunion, and he's going to end up showing all kinds of mercy and grace to the brothers. All of that stuff is absolutely true, and it'll be part of the way that Joseph also represents and is like Jesus, right? But I think there may also be another reason.
Well, he wants to find out how his family is doing. He wants to see his father. He wants to see his brother.
But if he declares himself, he could just still ask those questions, couldn't he?
Yeah, well, but in that respect, why didn't he, as soon as he became second in charge, send out a contingency of Egyptians to Canaan to go and grab him?
But he didn't.
He didn't do that. He's
right.
Part of the other dreams that his father was bound before him too. So I don't know if that.
So here's the other thing.
Prophecy fulfilled.
And again, we don't know this for sure, although I think you're going to see an indication in a few verses. He's the most powerful person in Egypt, or second. He has nothing to fear from his brothers. There's absolutely nothing the brothers can do to him. Not physically. But what about emotionally? Do you think he still has, even though he's forgiven and he's forgotten, and we read about that in the names of his sons, he hasn't completely forgotten it, otherwise he wouldn't have named his sons that. Okay, he's just put it past him. You think there's a potential that they could severely harm him emotionally still?
Sure.
Well, yeah, I think so. I think they did it first.
And I think he's not being vulnerable in front of them, okay, until he knows just what their situation is. Okay? Like I say, it's not God's job, I shouldn't say that. God's plan is not to get Joseph to be the second most powerful person in Egypt. That's just a means to his end. He's looking to remember how far away Jacob and the sons had gotten from God's ways and from Abraham? He's interested in bringing them back to God because they're going to be the founding tribes for this nation that's supposed to reveal God to all the other nations around him. Okay? And so he has a different plan for Joseph, if you will, or more. It's not just simply being in charge and helping everybody through this famine. Okay? He needs to use Joseph to get the brothers to repent. So he claims, he accuses them to be spies, and their response in verse 10 is, he said to him, no, my lord, but your servants have come to buy food. Well, hey, reasonable response. We haven't read anything about them being spies. That's probably what I would say too. And they go on in verse 11 and say, we are all the sons of one man. We are all honest men. Now, I have to tell you, I don't know how many times I've read this. I still can't get past that. We are all honest men. Really? Did they read the previous few chapters? We're all honest men. Your servants.
Well, maybe in their mind, because they don't live a life that follows God, that they think we're not that bad.
I think that's the point. Well, okay, sure, we've done some things that aren't great, but we're not that bad. We're still basically honest. You think that's the way God sees them?
No, he sees them like he sees us.
Yeah. Verse 12, yet he said to them, no, but you have come to look at the undefended parts of our land. Now, like I say, now who's going to argue with him at this point? Okay, they're claiming to be honest men. Well, either they are flat out lying, or as we said, their standards are highly skewed. Okay? And they go on in verse 13 to say, but they said, no, your servants are 12 brothers in all, the sons of one man in the land of Canaan. And behold, the youngest son is with our father today, and one is no longer alive. All right, well, so first of all, now Joseph knows his dad's alive, Benjamin's alive. He can see the 10 brothers in front of him. He sees that they're alive. Okay, so Joseph's got part of his questions answered. Okay. Technically, are the brothers telling them the truth?
Yes.
No, they know he's not. They don't know that he's dead.
They don't know that he's dead. They don't know that he's dead.
They assume that he is. So.
You know, they're propagating a lie, and Joseph knows it. And here's why I think this is so interesting to notice, is because they just got done claiming they're honest men. Oh, but our brother is dead. You don't know that. You sold him into slavery. Okay? Not a good start. Especially when Joseph knows what's going on. Now, given that, I think this makes it even more impressive. They tell Joseph, oh yeah, but one of our brothers is dead. They don't say anything about, well, we were going to kill him, but we decided to sell him instead. They don't do anything like that. Joseph knows it's a lie. What did he set out to do? To find out where they are. Are they still the same brothers, or have they grown? Have they matured? Have they, are they conscientious? Have they developed character? And they start by lying. Not a good start. Joseph in verse 14 says to him, it is as I said to you, you are spies. Now, quite frankly, that's enough to lock them up for the rest of their lives. The second guy in command of all of Israel, of all of Egypt, says, hey, you came down here just to spy, and we've got all this food, and blah, 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 blah. He doesn't need anything more than that. That's all he needs. 15, he goes on to say, but by this you will be tested. So he tells him right up front, I'm going to test you. By the life of Pharaoh, you shall not go from this place unless your younger brother comes here. Send one of you that he may get your brother while you remain confined, that your words may be tested whether there is truth in you. But if not, but a life of Pharaoh, surely you are spies. Joseph's putting a lot of pressure on him. Said he knew that if he accuses them of being spies, they're going to say, oh, no, we're not spies. Okay? But now he says, because they talked about the younger brother, he essentially says, prove it. Produce your younger brother so that I can know that you're not really lying to me. And I'm going to test you. So he tells them this is a test right up front. Okay? Now, I think that Joseph knows that, or suspects that they can't bring Benjamin down because of his dad. He also wants to see his full brother, his only full brother. Okay? And he needs Benjamin to come down so he can see how they're going to treat him. Okay? So this is kind of an important thing, and he's put them into this position. Notice how quickly he turns this conversation. If you don't bring him down here, I'm going to know you're spies. Okay? That you are lying, that you're not honest men. Okay? So he can do literally anything he wants. Okay? So he says, look, we're going to send one of your brothers back that he may bring your younger brother here while you remain confined. Verse 17, so he put them all together in prison for 3 days. Why does he put them in prison?
So that they'll know he's serious.
Okay, absolutely.
So they can have a taste of what he went through?
Mm-hmm. Isn't that an interesting thought?
Oh,
How long do you think 3 days is when you're in prison? Probably pretty bad.
Yeah.
How long was Joseph in prison?
Years.
At least
Yeah.
2 years. And we don't know for certain, but we know it was at least 2 years. It's a long enough prison term or time in prison to know what?
You don't want to be there.
I don't want to be there. Okay. Now, they don't know Joseph was in prison for two years. Okay. But like you said, it's enough for them to get a taste of it, and it's enough for them to know Joseph is serious. Now, of course, the other part of it is Joseph accused them of being spies and doesn't do something with them. It is going to look kind of weird in front of the Egyptians, right? So he throws them in the housecow for 3 days. But he shows mercy to them, okay? Now on 18, now Joseph said to them on the third day, do this and live. So he's let them out after 3 days. And he's let them all out after 3 days. And remember what he said in 16. I'm going to put you in jail. You send one of the brothers back to get your youngest brother. Now he's going to let them all out except for one. So he has changed his mind essentially, or at least he's decided to show them mercy. Maybe this was always his plan. Okay. And as part of trying to understand, hey, now that I'm in charge, if they know who I am, are they going to go crazy again about the dream and get all upset, or are they going to submit to God's plan? And so another aspect of sending them in prison is, you spend 3 days in a dank, dark Egyptian prison. You don't have TV, you don't have conjugal visits, you don't have cell phones, you don't get, exercise time outside to play basketball. My guess, it'll soften you up and it'll get your focus, right? So in contrast to Joseph spending 2 years there, they only spend 3 days. What I say is it's long enough for them to figure out that he doesn't want to do that. Okay. Later on, when they do know it's Joseph, I'm guessing, Joseph will share with them that he was in prison. We don't read that, but it would seem natural that he'll tell them what he's been through. And maybe they'll have a better appreciation for what they've actually done. Okay. So I don't know that Joseph is being vindictive, okay, but I think he's got some really good reasons for putting him there, and I think he's got some really good reasons for letting him out. Now, in verse 18, Joseph says, on the third day, do this and live, for I fear God. Now, the word here for God is Elohim. It's a very common use of word for God in the Old Testament by the Hebrews. It's the one that's plural, it's used in a singular sense. So in a way, I think the author is giving us a little bit of a hint here that notice he's not really utilizing the names of the Egyptian gods. He doesn't say, I fear Ra, I fear this, I fear that god of Egypt. He's actually using the word that the Hebrews would have used. And I think that there's a little bit of a hint here. He's saying, essentially, I fear the true God. Okay? Now, why would Joseph say that to them? Why would he say, hey, I do this and live? Now, that part's pretty clear. He's going to make it pretty clear to them. If you listen to me and you do what I say, you'll live, and we'll talk about that in a second. He says, for I fear God. Why would Joseph throw that part in there?
To maybe give them a hint?
Okay, but and I think that's why that particular word is used for God. But why does Joseph say he fears God?
so that they understand he's a good man, that he submits to a higher standard, maybe, or that they should fear God as well.
Oh, that's a great point. I hadn't thought about that. That's a really good point. He might be saying, hint, 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 maybe you should try this.
Or maybe that, he's gonna give them justice, or, treat them fairly, or something, or acknowledge that there's a power greater than him that, is handling stuff. I don't know.
Well, I mean, it gives them the opportunity to demonstrate mercy. The brothers technically haven't done anything wrong. Okay, not by coming down, and they're technically not spies. Okay, so in a sense, can and should Joseph keep them in prison?
Well, he can do whatever he wants.
No, he shouldn't.
Yeah, he shouldn't. I don't know this. I'm speculating here. So you decide. You think about it, pray on it, meditate on it, or not. You ever had to struggle inside with yourself about doing the right thing or doing what you want to do?
We all do, don't we?
Yeah. I'm wondering if Joseph isn't doing that a little bit here.
Oh, yeah, he's probably mad, throws him in jail.
Throws him in jail, and Paul writes about this, except, in quite a bit of struggle and quite a bit of detail, in Romans chapter 6 and 7, around this struggle about his new nature and wanting to do what God calls him to do, but he's still a sinner, and he can't help but end up doing, sinful things. And I'm wondering if Joseph maybe, is saying, look, I can't have this battle. I want to keep you in jail for the rest of your lives. I want to keep you in jail for 20 years, right? But I can't do that because I fear God. And if that's right, and a big if there, right? But if that's right, that's a real insight to Joseph and to Joseph's mind and where he is. He wants to do the right thing. He'd love to lock him up and leave him there and maybe just send one brother back to bring Benjamin down. But instead, because of his fear for God, he's going to do the right thing. Now, he's got to keep one brother, otherwise he won't get them to come back with Benjamin. But he's going to let them all go except for that one. I think it's a really interesting, like I say, I think insight into what Joseph is going through. Okay. And one of the reasons I think it's so interesting is because it helps us to really better understand what Joseph went through when he was sold. Verse 19, he goes on to say, if you were honest men, isn't it interesting? What's the first thing they tell him? Oh no, we're honest men. He says, okay, if you're honest men, let one of your brothers be confined in your prison. Okay, but as for the rest of you, go carry grain for the famine of your households. In other words, okay, I get it. If I leave you all locked up, your households are going to die. I'll send you all back with the grain except for one, okay? But you're going to have to bring this. You're going to have to bring him back. Verse 20, and bring your youngest brother to me, so your words may be verified, and you will not die. And they did so. Now Joseph throws this part in about you will not die. Well, it could mean that, yeah, I'll send up an army and come get you. But I think it may mean something else. See, for everybody else around here, except for who Joseph told the dream to, like Pharaoh, it's just a famine. They don't know what's going on for 7 years and that it's going to be like one of the record worst famines ever. But Joseph does. He knows they're going to need more grain. He knows they're coming back. Okay? Verse 21, then they said to one another, truly we are guilty concerning our brother, because we saw the distress of his soul when he pleaded with us. yet we would not listen. Therefore, this distress has come upon us. Well, what are the brothers saying? We're getting what we deserve.
In fact, what they did was really, really, really awful and truly despicable.
Isn't it? They're acknowledging they're reaping what they sowed, that they deserve this. And we get here some real insight into what really happened at that time that we haven't read before, because we saw his distress and of his soul, and when he pleaded with us, yet we wouldn't listen. Now, none of it's actually very surprising when you think about it. I mean, if you were in Joseph's spot, I'm guessing I'm sure I would have done the exact same thing. No, don't do this. Don't do this to me. Don't do this to our father. Don't, all that, right? Because at the time, Joseph doesn't know how it's going to turn out. He doesn't know God's going to take care of him and bless him the entire time, and it's all part of God's plan. Okay? So they're admitting their guilt, aren't they? They're acknowledging their guilt. They're saying that essentially they're reaping what they deserve. But remember, I said that Joseph is going to test their conscience, their character, and their commitment to Benjamin. And what has he done right now? What does he already know now? The answer to the first question. They do recognize that what they did was wrong. They do have a conscience. Notice what he goes on to say. Truly we were guilty concerning our brother, because we saw his distress of his soul and he pleaded, yet we would not listen. Therefore this distress has come upon him. Verse 22. And Reuben answered and said, well, see, if you had only listened to me. He said, did I not tell you, do not sin against the boy? And you would not listen. Now comes the reckoning for his blood. They understand what they've done. They've acknowledged it. And in verse 23, we keep reading. We read that they did not know, however, that Joseph understood, for there was an interpreter between them. See, part of the ruse that Joseph is keeping up to keep his disguise is he's got an interpreter. He's talking to them through an interpreter. This is partly why I said earlier, it says, when he talked to them harshly, it may mean that it may really do include this concept that he's speaking to them in an Egyptian that sounds like a harsh language to them or something. And they don't recognize that he understands exactly what he's heard. Okay? He understands it. And it's just that interpreter there is just to keep up this pretense. Okay? Now you gotta think about what Joseph must be thinking at this moment. In verse 24, he turned away from them and wept. Now the idea of turned away is he left. He didn't just turn not facing them. He left the room. When he returned to them and spoke to them, he took Simeon from them and bound him before their eyes. Then Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain and restore the man's money in their sack, and he gave them provisions for the journey, and thus it was done for them. So they loaded their donkeys with their grain and departed. Now, we'll come to this. This is where we'll pick up next time. We're getting ready to end here. But so Joseph is going to do just what he said. One of your brothers gets to stay. They didn't volunteer. Nobody volunteered a brother. So he just takes Simeon. Okay. Now there's been a lot of speculation and guesswork about why Simeon. You can go out there and you can read all kinds of writings that say, well, it's because Simeon was the meanest to him. Okay. I don't know. Joseph is indeed the second to the youngest of the 12. Simeon is the second oldest. Okay, but I don't think anybody knows. I think he just picks Simeon. I don't think we're going to find out why, or that there's any place that we're reading. He just does it. and and he doesn't seem, at least from what we read here, it doesn't seem like he gives them a second choice to decide who, all right, have you thought about it, who's staying, or anything like that. They didn't volunteer anybody, and we get this impression from the way the word is written that it's pretty abrupt. Okay, he comes back into the room after hearing their admission and their admission of guilt and everything else, and a degree of remorse. Okay, but notice what the remorse was for. The remorse is really for themselves. This is why we're under distress, is because we did that. There isn't yet a sense of we should have done this to our brother. I mean, it's in there, but the big issue is about them still, right? And this also is human nature. Oh, woe is me, right? Even if we've done something terrible, we don't often think of the other person first. We think more of ourselves, and they are truly doing that. But by Joseph coming out and kind of abruptly, without asking yet again for, giving them an opportunity to volunteer or something like that. Notice what it says here is that, he took Simeon from them and bound them before their eyes. Now,
that's so they know. Look, this is what happened to my brother. This is what we did to our brother when we sold him. They bound him up so they could sell him as a slave.
Not only that, if you're going to sell your brother as a slave, and we talked about the fact that it's not 100% clear in the way it's worded whether they actually sold him or they left him in the pit and the Midianites pulled him out and they sold him to somebody else. The language isn't really clear, but if you left him in the pit, wouldn't you kind of stand over the dune and watch and see what's happening? This is a reenactment. Here they are expressing all this guilt about what they did to Joseph. And the first thing Joseph does is he pulls one of them and binds him. I'm going to guess, just a complete guess on my part. Okay, it could be completely wrong. You think about it. I'm going to guess the way he did it was pretty similar to what happened to him on purpose, right? Like, let me help you here with your guilt. Let me remind you of what it was like. Let me help you feel what it was like for me. So Joseph is doing what? He's working on behalf of God to convict them of their sins. Remember what we said. The brothers of Jacob, the sons of Jacob, Joseph's brothers, remember they did evil thing after evil thing after evil thing. Okay, they had gone quite a bit away from the character of Abraham, from what God would have them do. They can't represent God whatsoever. God has to break them and bring them back. And he's doing it in part right here and now. Okay? I think there's a huge message for all of us in what we see happening here, is that these brothers can't return to God so they understand and appreciate what they've done. And Joseph isn't really being vindictive as much as he's doing the work of God and letting them and helping them see this. He's put them in this position now where they are reminded painfully these 27 years later of one of the low points in their lives and what they did to their brother by watching what happens to another brother. And Joseph has set them up for a really tough next step, which is if Simeon stays down there, which he's going to, what do they have to decide? Whether they're going to go back and get him.
Do we just go home and not come back and just leave our brother to whatever fate?
Yeah, all of them are going to have to make that decision. Now the famine's going to help them with that decision, as we're going to see. Okay, but it is interesting to see what's really going to happen here. Okay, and so just keep that in mind as we go forward. And of course, then Joseph is going to essentially make it a little bit more challenging as well. Okay. Any last comments or thoughts before we end for today? Any questions? It's really interesting when you get to go through this in depth and think about it, as opposed to just a big story about, Joseph is going to forgive his brothers, which is huge. And it's the whole reason we can look at Joseph and say how his life resembles that of Jesus. But when we go through it, we see all these other things that are going on too. All right. Anybody want to pray to close this? Well, Father, we do thank you for your forgiveness. That is only ours because of the work of your Son on the cross. As we started in your psalm and read about the fact that, we're all sinners. We've done things just like the brothers did, sometimes despicable things. And Father, we confess that we don't like being convicted of our sin and our guilt. But if that's what has to happen to bring us back to you, to bring us closer to you, to mold us more into the image of your Son, we ask that you would convict us of our sins. We ask for your mercy in doing it and to help us through that. And we thank you for the forgiveness that you've given us. Help us to never forget that forgiveness, that we are forgiven in you because of Jesus, and that means we don't have to have a guilty conscience either. And we pray all these things in Jesus' mighty name. Amen.